Here in the year 2012, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Dickens, considered one of our culture's greatest writers. Charles Dickens was indeed born in February of 1812 in England. He was the second of 8 children, and he had what he considered something of an unfortunate childhood. When he was just about 12 years old, his father was imprisoned for indebtedness. Now, at the time, debtors' prisons, as they were called, were intended not just for the individual who was charged with indebtedness, but for his entire family. Charles Dickens and his older sister were considered too old and of working age, so they did not go to prison, but Charles's father, mother, and his younger siblings all were sent to prison. Charles was sent to work in a factory at the time, and this was an experience which greatly influenced his writing and thinking in later years. He, in time, became a court reporter, then a newspaper reporter, and he always had a desire to write his own short stories and novels, and indeed, he began doing just that. Those works appeared first in serial form. A chapter might appear in an issue of a newspaper, and then another chapter in a later issue. They were later collected into whole novels. By the early 1840s, Charles Dickens had in fact published 5 full novels: The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, and Barnaby Rudge. And he was much praised and lauded and celebrated in England, but also in the United States. In January of 1842, he made his first visit to the United States, arriving in Boston after a very choppy sea voyage. He had a desire to see the United States, see its institutions, travel through the southern and what was then considered the western part of the country, as far west as St. Louis. Because he was a champion of the underdog, based on his experience as a child, he especially wanted to see what were then referred to as insane asylums, mental institutions. He wanted to see prisons. He wanted to see schools for the blind and the deaf. And he was actually appalled by some of those institutions. An institution that specifically appalled him wasn't an institution contained within a building, but it was the institution of slavery. His own country, England, had outlawed slavery, but of course it was still occurring here in the United States. He was so bothered by it and what he was seeing on the streets of Washington, D.C., that he refused to go any further south into the United States. He then curtailed his trip and headed west. He got as far west as St. Louis, and while he was in Illinois, one of the things he wanted to do was to have an excursion, a day-long excursion to see a prairie. What he referred to at the time as a looking-glass prairie. I'm guessing that was because of the way that the growth in the prairie, when blown by the wind, created a sort of bright light effect or a mirror effect. This excursion was considered too much for the women, and so Charles's wife and her female traveling companions remained at the inn they were staying at in Lebanon, Illinois, and the men and the party headed out to see the prairie. This was just one of many things that disappointed Charles Dickens on his visit to the United States. Another thing that disappointed him was the lack of copyright laws. His works were being published throughout the United States by this point, but he was receiving no compensation for his work. This was something that he, along with other writers of the time, American writers as well, such as Washington Irving, were staunchly fighting for. When Charles Dickens returned to England later that year, he published a book based upon his travels to the United States entitled American Notes. In it, he basically condemned America, not just for its institutions like slavery and its disappointing geography like the prairie in Illinois, but also for behaviors, habits such as the chewing and spitting of tobacco, a habit which particularly disgusted him. Americans, while they still loved his writing, were no longer fans of the man Charles Dickens, and there was sort of tension in the relationship between Americans and the man. It was smoothed over when he made his second and last visit to the United States 25 years later in 1867. He traveled throughout the entirety of the United States in this trip and felt that America had much improved since his earlier visit. He gave hundreds of readings of his works while he was here, and say those even led to his eventual death just 2 years later at the age of 58. Yes, many say that if Charles Dickens hadn't become such a successful writer, he would have been a successful actor. He was so impassioned in the readings, or excerpts of his readings during his visit to the United States, that many doctors claim it so weakened him that he died, as I said, at age 58 in 1870, while still working on yet another novel, his uncompleted The Mystery of Edwin Drood.